give a brief introduction of her and the workshop. Sabrina has been involved in animal welfare for over a decade. While her early work was mainly in rescue and shelter operations in North America, she was drawn to the plight of animal welfare in developing world, particularly Pakistan. Years of networking and research, coupled with her background in education and business, led her to identify gaps in how animal welfare was being addressed in multiple regions. Thus, she founded and is the director of Join Hands, where her work focuses on facilitating impactful, sustainable change towards improvement of animal welfare, primarily through facilitating international partnerships and collaborations. Sabrina is a passionate social entrepreneur with a vision that all life, humans, animals, and environment is worthy of care and aims to address the issue that not only improves animal welfare, but empower human communities and connect and protect natural environments as well. Today's workshop's title is Advocacy is for Everyone, Building Your Toolkit to be an effective animal welfare advocate. The session will explore elements of effective advocacy and how they are adaptable for anyone to use to maximize their probability for success. Through simple strategic planning practices, Sabrina will outline how we can approach animal welfare issues in our respective cultures and communities in ways that are relevant, effective, and realistic. Today's session is around 2 hours. Please, Sabrina, please take it from here. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Elia. Hello, everyone. I'm not sure where everyone is joining from, but good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for having me, everyone. I appreciate it. I certainly hope that I will live up to whatever expectations everyone has about this. But I'm really excited to be here. I'm joining you all from Switzerland, a little chilly outside, but we'll stay warm with our excitement here today. So let me just share my screen with you first. And Elia, maybe you can just give me a thumbs up. That's all good? Okay, great. Good. Okay, so I want to start first by saying that I think absolutely anybody can be an animal welfare advocate. I don't think there's a certain kind of credential that anybody needs to have. This is really for absolutely anybody who wants to do it. But the goal, I think, or I assume, is that we don't just want to be an advocate. We want to be a good advocate. We want to be an effective advocate. We want to make meaningful change for animals and the communities that care for them. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to talk to you about that today. Now, just to give you a bit of background about how I got into this kind of line of work. So I've always been passionate about animal welfare and sort of taking care of the world. And I got started into this industry about 10 to 15 years ago. I'm Canadian. I lived in Canada my whole life. And I spent a lot of time volunteering and working for different animal shelters. So that's very much a sort of a rescue industry. At the time when I first started my career in animal welfare, I wanted to start an animal sanctuary. That was my dream. I think most people who get into this have a very nice dream of opening some kind of rescue or sanctuary. That was mine. And to do that, I wanted to expose myself to as much as I could and learn as much as I could. So I started working and volunteering in animal shelters. But what's more, I really started trying to attend as many conferences as I could in North America for a couple of reasons. I wanted to learn best practices and see what was happening out there. I wanted to understand how people were talking about the issues, how people were dealing with the issues. And I wanted to network. I wanted to meet everyone that I could. Who were the best people in the industry? Who was doing what? And why were they doing what they were doing? What were their failures? What were their successes? I really wanted to start meeting people and developing relationships with them to learn what they were doing. And there were two things that I really took away from my years of experiences in North America and doing all of the networking that I did. The first is that there is really no shortage of passion or caring people in the world to address these issues. There are lots of people out there. We're here, there's tons of people out there, and it doesn't have to be people who are working on this in the field. It can be simple citizens who just care about a cat they see in their community, for example. There's lots of caring people out there. There's a lot of them are like us, we're really driven and committed to dealing with this issue. There's a lot of passion. What I also saw, though, was a negative thing, and I saw a lot of gaps in the industry. So what do I mean by that? I saw that despite the fact that there was a lot of passion, the same problems kept happening year after year. The same presentation topics happened year after year. And it meant that these issues are not really getting solved. So what I noticed is that there's a lot of Band-Aid solutions happening in this industry, but not a lot of dealing with the core source of the problem. And that really intrigued me, and that really made me wonder, why is that? And I think a lot of it has to do with dealing with a lot of these issues emotionally instead of strategically, which is understandable. These are volatile issues, they're passionate issues, they're sad issues that we're talking about a lot of the time. It's natural to have emotional responses, but I felt like in order for animal welfare advocacy to be effective, it needs to be strategic and it needs to be thoughtful and planned. So that was something that I really noticed. And as a result, I kind of shifted my gears and decided that maybe doing a sanctuary wasn't really the best thing to do to make a change in this field. So I decided, I come from a very entrepreneurial background. So then I decided I wanted to go and get my MBA and study business. And I wanted to understand, how do organizations succeed? How do successful organizations work? How are they profitable? How do they market themselves? How do they sell themselves? How do they achieve what they want to achieve and achieve their targets? And, I think in the corporate world, the goal is often profitability and money, right? But in the nonprofit world, and in the world that we're working in, it doesn't have to be money. The success equals achieving our goals, achieving our targets. It's essentially the same thing. We want to achieve our goals. So I was very interested in that process and approaching animal welfare from a bit of a unique perspective, or a different perspective rather, in that I didn't want to approach it emotionally, even though I feel emotional about it. So when I was invited to speak to you all today about advocacy, I thought, well, this is fantastic, because there's a ton of overlap in this, right? About gaps and seeing gaps in a business and addressing them. We're seeing a lot of gaps in this industry. So this is something that I hope I can address with you all today. Now, I want to stress that I don't think there's any one way to do advocacy at all. I really don't. But I do think that there's effective ways to do advocacy. I'm already breaking your code of conduct, Elia, because there's construction happening in my neighbor's house next door. So sorry about the distracting noises. What I want to stress is that well-meaning intentions and good intentions with our work doesn't always equate to being effective with our work, or at least not as effective as we could be with our work. So what I want to talk to you all about today is practices that you can use to strengthen your advocacy and help you use your time efficiently and increase your probabilities of success in whatever you're doing in your respective worlds, to help animals in meaningful ways. And I've seen these methods work. They've worked for me. They've worked for so many people that I've worked with and that I've learned from. And I've also unfortunately seen how failing to abide by some of these tactics can have a really negative impact on your long-term goals and relationship development. So just to give you a sense of where I'm going with the presentation today, the first section, I want to talk to you about how to make decisions about your advocacy approach when you're dealing with a particular issue. And then in the latter half, I want to talk to you about strategies and skills that you can develop to help you be as effective as possible. So just to give you a bit of a background about Join Hands, if you don't mind, I'm just going to turn my camera off so that I don't, sorry. There we go. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a background about Join Hands, we're a little bit different than a typical rescue or NGO because we operate more like a facilitator. So what we do is we work with local change makers. In this case, we particularly work in Pakistan, but we're branching elsewhere in the world right now. And we also work with animal welfare experts around the world to help develop programs towards improving animal welfare. Now, the foundation of our work is collaborations, and we use the expertise of others. So we're very actively trying not to reinvent the wheel because we want our advocacy efforts to be effective and efficient. I don't have a background in animal welfare. I'm not formally trained in anything in animal welfare. Everything that I know, I've been self-taught. It's been me attending conferences, networking, talking to people, getting my hands dirty in it and learning that way. But sometimes when we're trying to address a certain issue, you do need expertise and you do need people who have the background and the formalized training. And it's important to utilize that. I don't have that skill, others do. So my thought is I should do what I do well and let others do what they do well. So that's why Join Hands really focuses a lot on collaborations and capacity building. And what my goal today is to try to help you think about how you can be most effective with your skills and with your core issue to help you achieve your goal. Now, I'd like to encourage you all to use the chat feature. I'm going to be throwing out a lot of different questions throughout the presentation. And while I may not be able to answer them during the presentation, what I'm hoping that we can do is to just get your brains kind of thinking a little bit about the issue that you're dealing with and taking these questions and applying it to your specific situation to use this as a bit of a brainstorming session. So hopefully that'll be a little bit helpful for you. So the first question I want you guys to think about before we get started is just think about what is the problem or the core issue that you specifically want to solve in your advocacy work. So just take a moment to think about that. What is it that you're trying to solve? Is there a core issue that you're trying to address in your advocacy work? And I just want you to keep that in your mind as we go through the presentation and go through the questions, because they're going to relate to the issue that you're thinking about. So the next question I have for you, maybe it's an easy one, maybe it's a hard one. What is advocacy? We're going to be talking a lot about it today. So what is it? Well, the best definition that I've ever heard of advocacy is a very simple one: taking action to create change. Doesn't need to be more complicated than that. A lot of people think that advocacy is just lobbying or protesting, and it's true. Those things are advocacy, but advocacy isn't limited to those things. It's really about a collection of actions to create change and not just one particular thing. So I think there tends to be a little bit of confusion about that sometimes, but I just want to clarify that advocacy is a collection of actions. Now, again, we don't want to just be talking about being an advocate. We want to be effective, right? We want to be the best that we can be. So how do we do that? We have to constantly be asking ourselves throughout our work, can I be doing better? What can I be doing better? So let me start with a question to all of you. And you can type your answer in the chat here. What do you think is the most important thing that effective advocates need to do to be successful? In one word, what do you think they need to do? I would argue that there's nothing more valuable to your work than doing good research. Now, research keeps our efforts efficient so that we're not wasting our time and our energy and resources and operating blind when we're doing our work or when we're considering our issue. So given how important I feel effective research is to being an effective advocate, I want to walk you through some of the questions that you should be asking yourself to guide your advocacy work. So when you're thinking about your issue and how you want to be dealing with it, you should be doing some research about it. And what kind of questions should you be asking? That's what we're going to go through. I want to highlight that you could seriously spend days on these research questions, and I'm going to be trying to cover them in like 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So keep in mind, I'm really skimming the surface here. You could spend an entire week within your organizations doing these research questions effectively. So just try to keep that in mind. So your research should always start and end with this question: why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why is it important to you? And try to be as specific as possible. Don't be general. The more specific you get, the more you're going to get down to the reasons that you're doing this. Next, consider where you work. Now, where we work is often where we live or where we have personal associations to. Now, I'm Canadian. I live in Switzerland, but I'm half Pakistani. I've lived in Pakistan. I've traveled significantly to Pakistan and spent time there. I have a personal interest in the country. It means something to me. And that's why I work in Pakistan. Sometimes we work in the country where we live. Sometimes we work in a place that intrigues us or that we care about for whatever reason. So you need to be thinking about that location. Now, it's really vital to consider the country and the local context when you're thinking about what you want to do to deal with your core issue, because knowing the context will help you keep your strategy relevant. What works in China may not work in Indonesia. What works in Indonesia may not work in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So you can't be comparing yourself to what, a person in this country is doing or this. You can use ideas from them, but it's not applicable to your situation because you have your own unique situation and context. I've listed a few things on this slide here that you need to be thinking about in terms of your country context. And again, you could spend hours on each of those and thinking about how each of those different elements applies to your core issue. Now think back to the question I first asked you about what core issue are you thinking about? What specific problem are you trying to solve? Now let's get into the specifics of that. Ask yourself, why is this issue important? What's happening with regards to this issue where you are or where you're working? Are there records or statistics to support your view on this issue? Or is it just your feeling that something is bad? Has there been any changes to the issue where you're working? Recently, in the long term, list those for yourself. What's happening elsewhere in the world with regards to this issue or in similar surrounding regions to you with this issue? And here's a really big question. If this issue was not an issue, what would be different? What would be different? So if we're thinking about issues, we're talking about goals, right? What do we want to be achieving? So when you're defining your goals, you want to make sure that they're smart. What do I mean by smart? You want to make sure that they are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So specific. What exactly are you trying to change? What would success look like for you? Are your goals measurable? Can you define what your targets are or how you will measure your success? So we're taking it a little bit away from an idea and making it something more actionable. Are your goals achievable? Meaning, are they action-oriented? Or is it just an idea? Are your goals realistic? Meaning, are they appropriate for the context? Are they relevant? Again, what works in one country might not work in another country. So are they realistic for your context? And finally, are they time-bound? Is there a possibility for you to end your activities? Or will it be going on for an indeterminate amount of time? So what defines completion? What defines achievement? And I really want to highlight that when you're thinking about your goals, this should be a group process. This should never be something that you do by yourself. Engagement and dialogue are so valuable here. Next, awareness about possible challenges will really help you prepare for them in your planning. And we all have them. We all have challenges. So it might be something like cultural challenges. So in some cultures, they might have a preference for certain types of animals over others, or a disregard of certain animals over others. You might face economic challenges. In a country like Pakistan, for example, you're dealing with extreme levels of poverty or lack of resources. And those are real concerns in some of the countries where we work. And that makes certain options difficult. So trying to use solutions, for example, that require resources that aren't available, that's something that we need to be thinking about realistically. You might also face political challenges. I think this is pretty universal everywhere we go, right? What we're fighting for, it might not serve the goals of those people in power, or it might highlight their inefficiencies and we might get resistance. So be aware of what challenges you face with regards to your issues so that you can prepare for them and that you can plan for them. And to that, understand what the process of change is. This is so important. I cannot highlight this enough. Understanding how change happens in your existing system. If you don't understand how the system works or who the key players are, then you are operating blind. So you need to ask yourself, how does change happen in your country? Does change happen through a voting process? Are there bylaws or policies where change happens? Does change happen as a result of bribes or corruption? Does change happen as a result of community pressure or international pressure? So you want to be looking at past successes, if there's any, to try to understand the law and what will uphold your efforts when you're working on your core issues. So once you understand the inner workings of the system, that will guide your tactics and how you approach your issue. So ask yourself if there's policies or procedures that are relevant to the issue that you're working on. Look at the laws in your country, understand what supports and what challenges you, and look at what it would take to change those policies or adapt those policies. And then take it further and think about what would that require from you, step by step. What would you need to do to change those policies or those procedures that impact change? Ask yourself also if there's a chain of command. There's a tendency that many of us have, myself included, where we sometimes want to go to the president of something and say, I need to go to the top to go get this problem solved. That's rarely necessary. You can very often get things accomplished by talking to people lower in the hierarchy, because that's often where a lot of the grunt work gets done. I can't even tell you how many successes I've had simply by being cordial and respectful and developing relationships with assistants and secretaries. It's a huge asset, and I wouldn't undervalue that. Know the roles and responsibilities and capabilities of the different players in a hierarchy where change happens, and be proactive to develop positive relationships at all levels of the hierarchy. Once you understand what the process of change is in your country, it will help you be realistic about what kind of change is actually possible, rather than imagining what kind of change is possible. You'll know you'll know what you're dealing with. And finally, what are you able to do? So again, be realistic. So think about things like, how much time do you have? What kind of resources do you have? What kind of funds do you have to support your efforts? What kind of team do you have? Are you working by yourself? Do you have a team? These are things that are going to change what our advocacy approach can look like. And, our answers may not always reflect our intentions, but when we're answering honestly, then we make sure that our work is realistic. Now, once you understand the core issue, then you want to understand who's involved. So you want to be really clear about who you're trying to influence and why you're trying to influence that particular target audience. So ask yourself these questions. What do you want from your target audience? By when do you want what you want from your target audience? How do you want them to deliver that? And then, a little more uncomfortable, step out of your shoes and then ask yourself, what do they care about? Never mind what we care about. What do they care about? What's important to them? What kind of challenges do they face? And what are they capable of doing? We may have a sense of what we wish they would do. What can they do? And then once you know who your goals are centered around, then consider any other stakeholders that may be directly or indirectly relevant to your issue. Now, once you understand these key players, keep in mind that they will change. They will not stay the same. They will change over time. And think about how you're going to accommodate for that and what you can do to ensure your stability during change of stakeholders. Now, as an example, I had one week where I took a team to Pakistan to get an education project to go through. We had meetings set up for every single day of the 1 week that we were there with a Department of Education in one province of the country. And on Monday morning, we had fantastic meetings with the education secretary, and everything was great, and they were approving our project. On Tuesday morning, there were elections, government shifted, and every single person in the department that we were working with changed, and we had to start all over again on Wednesday morning. Keep in mind, we were there for 5 working days. We had to start all over again on Wednesday, repitch the whole project, start from scratch. Now, thankfully, we were successful in what we did. And the reason was because we had really worked hard to develop relationships, not just with those people at the top of the hierarchy, but their entire team that was working on the project on the ground in Pakistan. So when that transition happened, some of the key players who were still involved in that sustained, and we were able to maintain things with them. So keep in mind that good relationships are really fantastic for good crossover when instability happens. Now, you also want to be thinking about your timing. You know, we all have lives, we all have limited time, we want to be efficient with the time that we have. So it's really important to utilize a timeline in your planning when you're thinking about dealing with your issue in your advocacy work. So ask yourself, when do you want to, or when do you need to achieve your goal by? Do you have deadlines? So for those of you, for example, working in an organization, do you have internal deadlines? Maybe you're working by yourself, maybe you're moving and you have a, by moving day, you have to get something done before you leave. Maybe you have time sensitive access to funds, for example. So know what your deadlines are, know what your time constraints are. And it might be external. So for example, maybe government is going to change, so you need to get something done. Maybe a policy is going to change and you need to get something done. Or maybe there's an event or an activity happening where you are that's driving your goals. So try to be aware of that, and keep in mind that as a loose gauge, a short-term change is usually achievable in about 1 to 3 years. But when you're thinking about bigger things like policy changes or environmental changes or population changes or big statistics, then long-term change is what's usually required. And then a commitment to a long process needs to exist. So just be mindful of that. And this next question is one that I see missing all the time, and that's, when do you want to be finished? So a lot of people fail to think of this when they're doing their planning about how they're going to be dealing with their core issue. But ignoring this sets all of us up to be an eternal mouse on the wheel, running and running and running with no destination or purpose. For example, I had a team and we were working on a zoo project in Pakistan, and we were having meeting after meeting after meeting with government representatives, zoo management, citizens. It just went on, and there was a lot of positive things being discussed. But somehow these discussions just kept recycling and nothing was happening. And a lot of the advice we were sharing just wasn't being utilized. And so we had to internally sit down and say, what's our goal here? What is it we're trying to achieve, and by when? And then we decided that if X wasn't achievable, then we would withdraw from this initiative. And we did wind up withdrawing from the initiative because we realized that our input and our role was not serving any purpose any further. So knowing when you need to finish is a really important question to ask yourself. And I really want to highlight to you all that not completing something does not equal abandoning your cause. It actually keeps your activities focused and purposeful. You can always go back, reevaluate, readjust, start over again with different goals. Finishing does not mean abandoning. It's really important to know that. It really boils down to being effective with your time and your resources. So if we want to talk about success, let's ask, how do you determine your success? Well, to determine your success or failure, first you need to define your parameters of success. So ask yourself, what does victory look like? What's the end goal? What are you trying to achieve? Now, I want you to remember that targeted goals tend to be much more effective than symbolic goals. So we're talking about actions versus ideas. Targeted goals tend to be more effective than symbolic goals. Keep your goals and objectives SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound. Next, Relationships and communications are such a huge part of this work. So ask yourself if there's limitations to how or if you can work with others. For example, are there policies or procedures that allow you to work with other groups or not? For example, a lot of countries now have very strict policies on international organizations working in a local context. So that might dictate a lot of what you can or cannot do or how you can work with others. Maybe you have previous relationships or personal situations that allow you or disallow you from working with different groups or organizations. So ask yourself these questions, and because that will tell you how you can be involved with other people in the issue. And again, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. It's all about being efficient with our time and energy. So I highly suggest that everyone in their organization conducts a SWOT analysis. And really, again, like setting goals, don't do this by yourself. This should be a group exercise. Now, for those of you who don't know, SWOT analysis, SWOT, it's about examining your internal and external strengths and weaknesses, which are internal to your organization, and opportunities and threats, which are external to your organization. You can Google that. It's a very simple exercise, but it's well worth your time to do with your organization. It's all about doing what you do well and letting others do what they do well, and asking yourself how you can work with others who do things better than you, because we're not experts at everything, right? Some people have skill sets in something. We should be utilizing their skill set and keeping to what we do well and working together. I absolutely love collaborating with other people, with individuals, with other organizations, but it's also really important to be selective about who and how you work with others, because you want to make sure that you're aligned with the same goal. I try to work with groups who have a very similar attitude about mutual empowerment and trust, and who share the same goals that Join Hands has. Because sometimes people do have different agendas or different goals. So be mindful of that. Now, your approach is a lot about what kinds of activities that your work is going to entail. So for example, that might be things like letter writing, working with the media, making posters, doing community campaigns. Maybe you want to do polls and surveys or do education. For Join Hands, we focus a lot on education and capacity building. That's what works for us. That's where we feel our skill set is. Now, this I think is not going to be the most popular thing I say today, but I really think it's an important point. Isolated events are not really advocacy, and they rarely accomplish meaningful change. Now, when I say isolated events, I mean things like a one-off rally or protest, for example. Now, the reason that they're not advocacy or really have meaningful change is because they're not sustainable actions, and they don't have sustainable impact. Mostly they tend to be something like a feel-good action, to feel like something's been done. But it's important to remember that making a lot of noise doesn't always equate to making a difference or having an impact. Big noise can draw a lot of attention for a very short time, but then often what happens after the fact is not much. Nothing really happens much after that. So it's the activity that happens when the noise has settled, and that's where a lot of the job gets done. And that's where the greatest work is required. And I think that that's really valuable to remember and worth factoring into your advocacy approach. And lastly, how can you increase your influence? Now, I think a lot of us give all that we can in terms of our time, our resources, our energy. And honestly, I think literally some people even give their blood, sweat, and tears. For some of us, maybe you can give an hour a week. Maybe people can give more. Maybe you're doing this as a side thing. Maybe it's your job. But it's important to take a moment and ask yourself, can I be doing anything more? Or do I need to be doing anything less to be more efficient and effective? So asking where you can increase your influence really helps you grow as an advocate. So I encourage you to consistently take the time to reevaluate what you're doing and how you're doing it, to make sure that your time is spent efficiently and effectively. Now, at the beginning, I said we should start and finish your advocacy research by asking yourselves the question, why? So let's go back to it again. Why do you want to do this? Why this issue? Why have you chosen your issue to focus on? What are you trying to achieve? Ask yourself again, why does this issue matter? To whom does this issue matter? Think about your target audience. Why not another target audience? Why did you pick the one that you picked? What's the purpose or the advantage of the choice that you made? What can that target audience do? to facilitate the change that you're striving for? Or what can they not do? And then the last question about change, that question will give your why, direction, and outcome. So knowing what change will look like helps your why question be an action-oriented why. Now, I highlight these questions because I guarantee you will absolutely, if not already, get asked these questions time and time again in your advocacy work. You want to have clear answers to these questions so that you can represent your issue with clarity and with purpose to people who are asking, both in the field and out of the field. And also, focusing on these questions and developing answers to these questions, it helps you to create a solution-oriented issue instead of a problem-centered issue. And our goal is to make people embrace solutions and not retract from problems. So it's really important to spend some time with your issue. You know, in my experience, I can literally see that when I'm pitching people or talking to people about cooperating on a solution, they literally get jumpy in their chairs with excitement, because rather than being criticized for being responsible for a problem, they just get excited about being a part of a solution. And, you know, I think at the whole, you know, people, we're dealing with human beings, right? So I think people often want to consider change, or they're willing to consider change, but they don't always have the answers and they need support. So providing that is really helpful. Now, when we're talking about doing research to make your advocacy efforts effective and meaningful, we don't just want to research the issue. We also want to do some very honest self-reflection about what we can and can't do, either as an individual or as an organization. So ask yourself some really tough questions. Am I really the best person to be doing this? It's so important to remember that doing a job with good intentions but doing it poorly can actually cause more long-term harm than good. So if you're not the best person for the task, then rather than you doing it, collaborate or work with others who, or enable others that might be the best, because ultimately our shared goal is that we want to impact change. And we want to do it effectively, and we want to do it positively. So we should really be working to empower the people who are the most capable of a certain activity and use our skills where they can be best utilized. Now, worst case scenarios, you know, sometimes despite our best efforts, it happens. The worst case scenario does happen sometimes, and it's devastating, right? An animal that we're fighting for dies, or we lose access to them, or maybe a policy that we're fighting for or against goes through or gets shelved, or a practice, you know, some kind of ritual practice happens that we're fighting against in countries, or an event we're trying to stop happens. This is just part of it, right? It's the hard part of the work that we do. But we need to be able to ask ourselves and consider what we will practically do when that happens, because it will happen, so that we're not emotionally reacting, but we're thoughtfully being prepared to stay on our course with our long-term goals. It's hard, but it's really important. I mentioned it before that, you know, sometimes what we want to do and what we can do are different. So it's important to be realistic so that you can guide your planning and increase your capacity for success. So, you know, for example, I work from home. I have 2 little kids at home. I could easily work like 14 hours a day on the stuff that I'm interested in. I'm super passionate about it. I'm dedicated. I know that I really want to do it. I'm driven every single day. But I have to change diapers, and I have to cook dinner, and I have to, you know, run errands, and I have to look after my life at home. And that's just my reality, right? So I have to be realistic about what I want to do versus what I can do, and use the hours that I have as efficiently as possible, but also set goals within the parameters of what I'm able to do, not what I want to do. And that helps us be much more efficient with what we're doing. So it's not always the funnest question to ask ourselves, but it is important. Also, I mentioned before, you know, starting from scratch, it is so rarely necessary. when you're doing the research, you get to know the context, and then you can be realistic about where and how your role can advance the cause. And the biggest thing to know here is that we just got to take ego out of it, right? We all want to be the star. We all want to achieve things and be the one who accomplishes something. But if someone else is already doing it, maybe the question is, can I help them do it? Can I help them do it better? Maybe they're not doing it perfectly, but can they be empowered to do it better rather than you starting something from scratch, right? So we're always thinking about not reinventing the wheel, not wasting time, energy, resources. We want to use what's already in play, right? And I think this question is super duper important. So do you like working with people? Are you a good communicator? Are you good at public speaking or presenting? A big one is, can you handle yourself in stressful or combative situations? We all face them, right? Now, if the answer is no to some of these questions, maybe you're not the best person for certain jobs, and there's nothing wrong with that, because it can do more harm than good if you're trying to do something that you're poor at. For example, if you're really not good in a stressful or combative situation, we're dealing with really volatile issues sometimes, right? Like we're literally dealing with life and death sometimes of animals. It's emotional. So if you're not able to handle yourself in a stressful or combative situation, then maybe someone who is able to do that should be the one doing that, because sometimes it can do more harm than good. I have to say that, in my early years, whenever I would ask people in this field, why are you in animal welfare? What are you interested in? Like 8 times out of 10, people would say to me, I work with animals because I hate people. I just can't stand people. They're awful. And I really used to just completely baffle me, because all I would think in my head is, well, a dog's not going to change the law. We're working with people. We're working in animal welfare and animal rights, but at the end of the day, what we're ultimately doing is human behavior change. That's what we're really doing. We're focusing on human behavior change to help animals, right? So we need to believe that people will make changes, that people are capable of change. We need to believe that people can change and can be good. And if you don't believe that, then you're kind of fighting a losing battle, because we're saying that we're trying to make people change their behavior, but we don't believe they can change, right? It's this like vicious cycle. So it's really important to say, can I work with others? Do you want to work with others? Do you like working with others? And work on that, because it's so helpful. It's so helpful. So I want to pause here. I've kind of covered a lot, and I want to give you all an opportunity to digest this. So we're going to go into some breakout rooms, I think, here. So I wanted to pose 2 questions to you all so that you could get thinking a little bit about this research questions. And as I said, I've skimmed the surface. There are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of questions you could ask yourself, days you could spend on this. But hopefully it gives you just a little bit of a teaser of what kind of things you should be thinking about when you're thinking about your issue and your context and how you can approach your work. So the first question I want you to think about is, as we went through these these research questions, did anything pop up in your mind that, oh, maybe I should be doing this differently? Or maybe you feel, hey, I'm on track, I'm doing this all great, I'm well on my way. So whether your answer is yes or no, why? Why do you feel you should be doing something differently? Or why do you feel you're on track doing the right thing? And the second thing that I'd like you to think about is, I talked a lot about action-oriented activities, action-oriented targets, and not focusing on ideas, but focusing on specific targeted goals. So think about action-oriented targets and outcomes. What kind of outcomes could you use in your issue with your work to monitor your progress, or you're achieving success, or whether you fail? So when you're thinking of these questions, try to think in terms of change. So what kind of changes could you observe or could you measure that would suggest to you or indicate whether or not your efforts are making a difference towards your core issue? So you can choose one question, you can choose both, you can whatever you like. My goal here is to just try to get you thinking about your issue in a more specific, targeted way.
With me, I had Angel from Hong Kong and Kaho from Japan, who are both also part of Animal Alliance Asia. And so the question we tackled first was, what came up for us? there's no did anything come up, things came up for sure. And so what Angel talked about, the core problem that she has identified and that she is working on is the plight of farmed animals. And but another issue that she would like to focus on is problems with wildlife. But she was able to identify that she's really not that well aware of the complexities, of the intricacies of everything that is involved in wildlife and the entire scope of it. So that is something that she would like to explore more and understand more, to see how she could be a better advocate for that. Something else that also stood out for Angel and and also for me was understanding the process of change in the places where we are at. So for example, Angel doesn't have a very clear-cut, solid understanding of legal frameworks and how they operate in her country. And this is something that she would like to think more about and learn more about. So there's that. Then there was Kaho from Japan, and they are a student, and they're also part of different organizations and Animal Alliance Asia. And so for them, and speaking in terms of identifying a core issue and finding values that align with theirs, they found it really helpful to work with Animal Alliance Asia, because there is a process of collaboration over here. Like, look at all of us from different countries, different cities, right? There's a process of collaboration which leads you to develop a cross-cultural understanding of issues related to animals. And she wanted to examine if oppressive ideologies, if oppressive modes of being are present even in animal advocacy. For example, could we be culturally insensitive, or could we be racist in when we are working for animals, when we're advocating for animals? So being part of a platform like this, so this could be a core value that you could identify as an advocate, right? Do I want to also focus on the politics of how I operate and on the politics of human-animal relationships themselves? Then there was me. What stood out for me was the fact that I have for years been really intrigued by how urbanization because I'm from Karachi, and it's a huge urban sprawl. And I have always been really concerned about how urbanization is impacting our relationship with animals and with nature. And I realized in all these years that, all right, that actually encompasses a lot. And I also worked with children in schools, and that also helped me realize that actually what would be really helpful is if I focus on one thing. And what I want to focus on very, very specifically is dog culling, and working with communities that are affected by rabies, by stray dogs. And the things I would like to specifically focus on is education and legal policies. And legal policies are where it's just not my forte. Something else, Sabrina, that you said that stood out for me was, once again, process of change. And you talked about how it is not important for you to go to the top guy. You can develop relationships with people who are working at lower levels. And it's a relief to know that, because being in Pakistan, being in Karachi, this is something that's really intimidating for me as an activist and as an advocate. It is the culture of bribes. It is the culture of corruption. It is also how work like this, especially if I want to work on infrastructure and reimagining infrastructure, can be really dangerous in a city like Karachi, because we've had activists like Parveen Rahman, for example, who've been killed. So that is something that intimidates me. But I feel like I actually did not know much about, and have an imagined anxieties about it. Like, I did not know it would be helpful to just develop relationships at a lower level. I'm thinking, how do I get in touch with that politician? Because I think that's the only way I can affect change here. So that's something I feel like I need to educate myself on. The second question was about the outcomes, and I defer to Kaho and Angel on this because they're already working in an organization, and I feel like it can be more tangible over there. So they talked about how they're able to measure outcomes. Successfully or not is something they both question, but through the amount of people they're able to reach through their conferences and through their social media, right, and the level of engagement they're getting. Then they also take feedback through surveys, and that helps them gauge, but not quantitatively, the impact they're having. And so this is so they would also like to ask you, like, how do you measure change through subjective means of assessing your outreach, for example. And they also have timelines, and they have SMART principles in their organization through which they do this. I personally am working as an individual, so if I was to work with an organization, I would really like to learn because this work is so emotional. I would really like to learn how to set like outcomes and measure them. And for that, I think you have to be really, really research minded, research oriented to be able to do that. So there's that.
Thank you so much for your insight. And moving forward, group 3, please raise your hand, the spokesperson for group 3. Kindly keep time in mind. We might have only 3 minutes to discuss your insights in the room. Thank you. Group number 3, spokesperson, Tech, can you please unmute them? Thank you. If there's no one from group 3, then group 4, please, a spokesperson from group 4, please raise your hand. We have Denise.
Yeah. Hello. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I think for our group, we mainly discussed on the first question, and I'll just touch on the common topics that were brought up in our group. Yeah, so I think we felt that if we look at all the questions posed by Sabrina before we actually start approaching our advocacy, then there will be many things that we would do differently. So I think first thing we felt that we need to do a lot more reflection, not just and research, not just on the issues and solutions, but also more inwardly on ourselves and our team. And also we felt that we need to understand the systems better and know how change occurs in our local context. So definitely this also links to understanding our context better, where we work, as well as the challenges in our local context, and then how we can overcome them. Yeah, and I think the last point would be to understand how to better identify our goals and whether they're achievable. Yeah, I think this is quite challenging, especially when there are many overlapping needs and challenges, which make it hard to really identify our real goals. Yeah, so I think these are the few points that we brought up that we thought we could do differently in the future. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your insights. And Charles, can you please unmute Carla from group 3? Raise your hand, Carla, please. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. So, hello everyone. For our discussion from group 3, we have Vince and Ella, and what we talk about is for Ella and Vince, I think they have a common denominator, which is finding alternative ways for food consumption or food animal consumption. And Vince mentioned about attending the COP27 for next year, and what came out with their question number 2 is the clarity of questions to ask for COP27. And on my case, I am from an animal organization that focuses on responsible pet owner, educating people regarding responsible pet ownership. And from our organization, we're trying to identify also what will be the better way of, or the number of people adopting from the local shelter and from the local animal pound rather than buying from pet shop. And also identifying what success could look like for chicken welfare. And we're actually working with World Animal Protection for better chicken option. And yep, that's it for our team. So hopefully, um, with uh, with the knowledge of SMART and SWOT analysis, we can apply them in the near future for our advocacies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please, spokesperson from room 5, raise your hand. Charles can unmute you.
Hello. Hi, Sabrina. So right now I'm not working with any organization, so I'm just gonna bring a study case, which of an organization I wanted to work with. So in Thailand, we are trying to reduce the use of eggs in battery, chicken in battery cages. So we're trying to get more corporations to use cage-free eggs. And according to this organization, a lot of corporations are already adopting the cage-free eggs policy. So like a Lotus, Burger King in Thailand, they're embracing that the cage-free eggs policy. So I think they're doing well because before the organization actually doesn't want people to eat eggs at all, but which is like it might be a long-term goal, but right now it's easier to do it as incremental steps. So getting up corporations to adopt to free cage eggs are much more, it's a smart goal than getting people or corporations to stop egg eating or egg producing altogether. Yeah, and I think that's what I learned. And also I was thinking of I was applying to be a corporate engagement manager, but after one of the questions that you posed, like for example, am I the person to be doing that? I'm not sure, like because there may be a lot of stress, and yeah, I'm more of like yeah, I'm more of like happy person. So maybe I have to ask that question too, like, or try to correct if I wanted to do that work, I might have to collaborate more with people and get more experience.
Thank you so much for your insights. Since we're running short on time, we would ask Sabrina to continue with the workshop, and group 6, if you could type your comments in the chat box, so we can all have access to that. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for all those comments. Elliot, do I have time, like a minute or two, to just respond to a couple of those points? Because I do think some important things did come up. So first, it was mentioned, that you didn't work for an organization, but you're only working for yourself. I really want to highlight that that's also advocacy. The fact that you're here, the fact that you're learning and exploring and doing something is it's encompassed under that umbrella of how can I influence more change? How can I be better, right? Like that's a part of it. So I really hope that you all go away with this understanding that you don't have to be a part of a big organization to make change. For example, Join Hands is one person. You're looking at her like that's it. I'm one person, but I focus on collaborations and working with other people. So really don't think for a moment that as an individual you're not capable of doing anything. So I want to highlight that point. it came up that some people struggle with isolating one issue that they care about. I get that. I have that problem too. You know, you care about these issues. You hear about a wildlife issue, you want to help with that. You hear about a dog issue, you want to help with that. It's really hard. So, you know, one way that I've approached that in my own work is I have a really hard time isolating an issue that I want to focus on because I do deeply care about so many, but it's impossible to focus on everything. You do have to pick something. You do have to focus on something. But, you know, I have a background in education. I used to be a teacher about 100 years ago. I care about, you know, I believe in the power of changing attitudes. And I realize that's something that I really value. And so for me, education is a huge part of what I do and allows me to dabble a little bit in different areas of animal welfare. So I do think it's important that you focus on one thing and that you don't be too scattered about what you're focusing on. But there's, you know, everyone is different. There's ways around that. That's my loophole around it. But I do still focus on education a lot. So that's just something that I wanted to throw out there as well. You also mentioned, you know, long-term goals versus step-by-step. I'm really glad you brought that up because we're going to get a little bit into that idea a little bit later in the presentation, but do keep that in mind because I think it's a very valuable point that, you know, that you had to adapt to something. And we'll touch on that. And then finally, process of change seems to have come up with every group. So I think that was, you know, a real highlight for everybody. And it was for me as well. You know, it really is important to understand how things happen in the system. And, you know, I understand the fear of feeling like you need to go to the top to make a change, but I really want to highlight that that's not necessary. You know, when I was working with some individuals in Pakistan about dog culling, for example, I was working with different government people, talking to them about this. And what happens with process of change is that often change starts at a very low level. You know, using the example of Pakistan, for example, you're often going to very individual districts and community members who are making changes to bylaws that apply to a particular district. And then when you're talking about culling, you're talking about it in a district way, right? You're not talking about it in a provincial way. You can talk about it in a provincial way, but it starts somewhere. It starts with the smallest level policies and it works its way up. So, you know, don't undervalue the value of working in small pockets sometimes, because you start developing records, you start developing examples, you start developing relationships. So there is a value in that. And I'm really glad if that idea of process of change struck a chord with a lot of you. It also came up that there was a challenge to come up with outcomes. And I want to highlight and stress to you all that the kind of work that we're doing really is rooted in a lot of soft outcomes and not hard outcomes like quantitative outcomes, right? This is very much like the social sciences. We're talking a lot about changes in attitudes and changes in behaviors with people, right? And that's sometimes it's very hard to measure. So without without really intense statistics or polling or surveying, it's hard to know what those things can be. And we rely on things that are a little bit softer, like media reports or community feedback and things like that, right? So keep that in mind. This wasn't an easy question I posed to you, right? It's difficult to think about hard targets, especially if you're not working on a specific project. But the reason I pose it is I want you to start thinking about how can you make your work actionable? How can you measure it? Now, I do have some examples of some outcomes here. I can read them to you here, and it gives you a bit of an idea of what you can be thinking about when we're talking about change. So for example, increased awareness by the community about an issue. That could be an outcome. Changes in beliefs or attitudes. Increasing agreement amongst people on how to recognize a problem. Increased number of donors or supporters or volunteers. Increased media coverage. Policy changes, policy improvements, policy implementation, policy enforcement, increased political support, increased collaborations, increased partnerships, improvements, and then we can get into the harder numbers, right? Improvements in conditions, less dogs culled, less reports of animal abuse. So, you know, these are just some examples of the kind of things you can be thinking about, but I want you to understand that it is often about soft outcomes and not quantitative things. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you again so we can continue. And is that shared properly, Elia, just so that I know before I move forward? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so now we've talked about research questions that you can use to start thinking about your issue and thinking about your advocacy. And now once you know your issue, and remember I said that this could really be like a days-long process, right? So try not to do this in an hour or 2 hours. Spend some time on it with your teams, or if you're doing it by yourself, spend some time on it. Take a couple of days. Once you know this issue, then you can start working on your strategy. And your strategy is your plan or your roadmap of how you will address your issue and achieve your goals. Now, it's tough for me to get into how to put your strategy together because everyone's strategy will be different. You're all in different places. You all care about different things. You're all dealing with different things, right? So everyone's strategy is going to be different, but there are some tactics that you can use to make sure that your strategy is a good one when you're doing your planning. And there's some of these that I feel need a lot more focus in animal advocacies, but let me start with the basic ones first. So first one, I've driven this point home, I hope, do your research, right? It's so important. Don't operate blind. Know the context, know the issue, know the history, know the process, know the stakeholders, really know everything you can, and you just can't ever know enough. And remember that research is not a finite thing. It is an ongoing process. So once you've done your research, don't feel like you're done. Maybe you need to go back and ask all these same questions again in a year and say, has anything changed, right? Research is not a static thing. You also want to know what your strengths and your weaknesses are and what other strengths and weaknesses are, and utilize that knowledge accordingly. So once you've done your SWOT analysis, once you've looked at your stakeholder review, then start thinking about how you can use that information to design your strategy and how you're going to address your issue. And to that, you want to harness the energy of locals. So, you know, I'm not sure what everyone's situation is. Some of you might be in the countries where you're working. Some of you might be elsewhere, like myself, working in a country where you don't live. It's so valuable to harness the energy of local people who care. But I caution you, do this with purpose and do it with direction. You know, a local champion can be a person, it could be a group of volunteers or citizens, it could be an organization, any local person that would champion your cause. And you know, word of mouth support for your work, it can be so positive and really powerful. But I really want to highlight that it needs to be harnessed well. It needs to be directed because you want to ensure that it doesn't blow out of proportion. You want to keep its focus towards your goal, right? Now, a good strategy plan will also have an everybody wins approach. So, you know, if we're in it for the long haul and we want to make sustainable change, we want to have meaningful change, we have to work together. It is impossible to achieve what we're trying to achieve doing it on our own, right? And I want to highlight that you have to have this attitude, especially with those people who do not share your point of view and who are in power. It's very easy to pat ourselves on the back with each other when we all feel the same way, right? But we want to make sure that we have a positive approach with the people who don't share our point of view and who are challenging what we're trying to do and work together with them. We really need to make an effort to show our opponents that we're willing to work with others because then they'll want to work with us. And it really boils down to what Listenery, I don't know how to say your name properly. I'm sorry if I'm butchering it, but we need to show people that we're adaptable, right? And adaptable does not have to mean compromising. It just means that we have to know how to give and take. Now, the next 4 that I'm going to mention are ones that I really feel are lacking in this industry quite a bit. So know the issue inside out when you're designing your strategy. Do your research and don't just know the goal you want to achieve, but know the solution you want to present. You can very easily catch the attention of people by creating awareness about the issue and what you think should change. But if you don't provide a solution when you're the one acting as the expert on the issue, then your opponents are certainly not going to provide a solution for you, right? So always have a solution and be able to answer questions about it. So I can't highlight this enough. Invest in relationships, and relationships not just with people in the industry, but relationships with your adversaries, with your opponents. This is the backbone of good advocacy work, because ultimately we are dealing with people. We are in the market of human behavior change, right? That is really what we're doing. So develop relationships, and how you engage with people, it tells them what kind of person or organization you are to work with. And generally speaking, people don't want to work with people they don't trust, or people they don't respect, or people they don't like, especially when you have opposing views, right? So be really proactive with your relationship development and with your networking, and not just like-minded people, and try to have an attitude of we're in this together. This is super, super hard. We are dealing with emotional issues. And I can tell you from experience, I have literally had people ghost me. I've had wonderful relationships with people in government, with, you name it, really, with anything. And then we'll be messaging, we'll be emailing, we'll have Zoom meetings. And then out of the blue, they just decide, well, I don't want to do what we've been talking about, and they disappear, completely ghosted. I cannot reach them. They don't respond to me. It's like they never existed. And, that happens. It really happens. And you just have to keep plowing through, because what's happened in the past is that I've had those same people who ghost me or stop talking to me suddenly reach out to me out of the blue and say, oh, hey, Sabrina, we're dealing with this issue. What do you think? Can you talk to us about that? And think about how powerful that is. Think about how powerful it is if somebody can feel comfortable enough to reach back out to you for advice after they may not have had the best relationship with you. That's really powerful, because then what we're doing is we're providing a good quality resource to somebody to ask for help, so really don't underestimate the power of developing your relationships, especially with your adversaries. Next, make it relevant. How you frame an issue is so much more important, I think, than what arguments you use to defend it. Because what makes sense to you may not make sense or resonate with others. And when you want to convince someone of your position, you need to do it in a way that's meaningful to them and not to you, right? You have to convince them about what they care about, not what you care about. That should be your foundation. That should be what you're talking about. So, it came up about culling street dogs. Now, let's admit, there may be some officials or some community citizens or some government officials, they just don't care about treating dogs humanely, right? Like, we may not like it, but that's just the reality. They have bigger problems. There's, maybe there's people who aren't eating, maybe there's housing issues. I don't know, right? But maybe that's just not on their to-do list. They don't care, right? But what they may care about is things like public health. They may care about community safety. Maybe they care about waste management, right? So we need to think about what they care about and start from there. Catch their interest from what they are interested in, what issues are important to them. Go back to that question we asked about who your targeted audience is, right? One of the questions was, what do they care about? If you're informed about what they care about, then you can find overlap between your issue and what they care about, because guaranteed there's going to be overlap, right? Work on their goals so that you can indirectly achieve your goals. Learning how to reframe your issues to a local context and understanding will give you more receptive audiences. And then your audience will feel understood and appreciated for their viewpoint. And once you show them that you're listening to them and that you're hearing them, the reverse will happen. They'll start hearing you. They'll start listening to you and respecting what you have to say because they feel respected. It's really important. Make it relevant. Make it relevant to the context. Make it relevant to the audience. And this one, I have to say, is one that I think is missing so much in this industry. And it's particularly at the grassroots level. And I think it's to such a great detriment. Now, I think this is an example of how doing things inefficiently and poorly can actually create more work for people who are doing things well. Because most of the time, people are doing great work. People are trying their best. They're working hard and they're doing good things, right? But if you don't document it in a meaningful way, then it doesn't add strength to the issue at large, right? And it also doesn't add strength to what you're doing. So when I say keep records, I literally mean keep records of everything. I'm not in a creepy way, like don't record phone conversations or things like that, right? With people not knowing. But I mean, keep records of your meetings, even if they're casual over a cup of tea or something. Write an agenda, take minutes, document what you discussed for your reference, right? Keep records of any negotiations you have with people. Keep records of community engagements and activities, of media interviews, reports that the media does, any publicity that they do on an issue or work that you're doing, or any activities about the issue as a whole. If you're part of an organization and you're conducting a program, know what you're measuring. Keep records of your data from the very first day. I can't even stress how much value there is in documentation and reflection, because keeping records, it accomplishes two things for you, okay? So the first thing that it does is it creates an account of what's been done. So for example, if you ever have a legal approach come up for a particular issue, or you need to justify why it's even important to address this issue in the first place, you have evidence to support you and to support others in the field about what you're doing. And the second thing is that if anybody wants to join your organization or come on board or partner with you, or if you want the work that you're doing to succeed beyond your role in the work, then there's no starting from scratch. And there's a process in place so that you can understand what's been done and others can understand what's been done. And we're talking about this efficiency now, right? We're talking about being efficient, being effective, creating strength, not wasting time on reinventing the wheel. Make a process for yourself, make a process internally so that you're using your resources and your time efficiently. Now, those are tactics that will help you develop an effective strategy, but what about qualities that will help you personally be an effective advocate, right? Because at the end of the day, we're human beings. We all have our own personalities and characteristics. We're strong, we're weak, right? We all have our own individual approach. So I want to stress that having some or maybe even none of these skills, it does not mean you can't be a good advocate. So know that right away. But it should get you thinking a little bit about what kind of roles or activities you're best suited to. So first, you want to be capable about trust building, right? If people don't trust you, they don't want to work with you, they don't want to talk to you, they don't want to turn to you for guidance and advice. So you want to be seen as reliable and credible. Pretty straightforward, right? If you don't like working with people, or if you don't even like people, then be honest about what you can achieve if relationship building or relationship management is the foundation of the work that needs to be done. You know, maybe someone else is better suited to the task. That's okay. That's okay. You don't have to do everything, right? But be honest about what it is that you can and you can't do so that the best people can do the task. Now, with communication, the ability to be clear and concise is important when you're speaking, when you're listening, when you're writing. And for some of us who work in multiple countries, for example, we're sometimes going to be dealing with multiple languages, right? So you want to be able to navigate those challenges or have somebody who can. So I can give you a funny example. I'm on Zoom calls all the time with people from different countries all the time. And I've actually had people from different countries message me privately before or after meetings saying, Sabrina, you know, I really love that person who's in the meeting. They're so fantastic, but I don't understand a word that they say. And it happens, right? Like this is part of it. So one of my jobs when I'm in a Zoom call, for example, is I have to sometimes repeat something someone says slowly and clearly, and so that everyone can understand. I have to do check-ins during my meetings. Does everyone understand? Does anyone have any questions? This is all part of good communication, right? So, and it can be very complex, especially when we're working in multiple countries with multiple languages, with accents, for example. It's tough stuff. So ask yourself if that's something that you can do. Now, research, I keep honing in on this. Research is finding information. That's one thing, but can you analyze it? Can you make sense of it? So collecting information is one thing. What do you do with the information once you have it? Can you make it relevant in micro, macro ways to the issue that you're talking about? And I want to make sure that you understand that research doesn't mean, it's not just limited to, you know, researching on the page or researching online or something. It's also about communications, doing research when you communicate with people. So for example, being a good listener and being open-minded are such huge assets to effective research. You would be amazed at what listening can do and what people have to say. It can tell you loads about what you want to know, right? So if you're having a conversation with someone about an issue who has the power to influence that issue, you can listen to the nuances of things they say, the sarcastic comments they make, or the frustration comments they make. You can learn loads about the issue and what's driving it, you know, behind the people that are driving it. So research and analysis are big in all forms of communication. And, you know, with flexible and committed, it's important to keep your ultimate goal in sight. It came up earlier, you know, it's important to know when flexibility is needed. It's important to know when you need to bend. There's a saying in English, maybe you have in other languages too, lose a battle, win the war, right? Know your battles, know which ones you can lose that will be low risk to you achieving your greater goal. And when you demonstrate to your adversaries that you're capable of giving a little bit, then you show them that you can, and then they're inclined to do it back to you. So it's really a really valuable thing. You also need to be, when you're doing advocacy, you need to be able to be a problem solver, but you also need to be able to find adaptable solutions if things change, because you will be presented with challenges. So being effective, it really requires you to be able to think about issues in both ways. And social aptitude, this is a funny one because this one I think is often overlooked, but it's super duper important. Can you read a room? Can you sense when people are uncomfortable or excited? Can you react appropriately? Can you make on-the-spot decisions in a meeting or during discussions? Do you have appropriate timings and appropriate ways of reacting to people? You know, it may not seem so important at first thought, but I can tell you from experience that sometimes decisions are made instantaneously by people in power just based on a first impression or based on their feeling or you know, so when you understand how impressions are made, that's a really powerful tool. And if you've got that skill, you should use it. But if you don't have that skill, then use someone else who does have that skill, because those kind of nuances are very subtle in communications and very powerful. So find someone who can harness that. Now, it seems funny that I include good manners because it would seem obvious, right? It's one of those universal qualities that apply to every single situation. And it's so basic. We teach it to kids. But I think this is often forgotten when we're pursuing our goals in this industry, especially because there's so often a knee-jerk reaction or an emotional response to really crappy situations or behaviors. And it's hard not to get emotional. You know, when you see somebody being an idiot or you see somebody being so awful, it drives you bananas. You want to say something, do something, get angry. But I can't stress enough, good manners will get you so far, not just here, but in any line of work. So my suggestion is be polite to everyone, and not just the people that you need something from, or not just people at the top, really everyone. Say thank you. Don't interrupt people. Don't insult people or their actions. Don't lie. Be very respectful. Be aware of cultural norms. This is really big, right? What's okay in one culture might not be okay in another culture. Smile. Respect people's time, be on time, abide by deadlines, even if other people don't do those things. I know, you know, in Pakistan, for example, it's super normal for things to start late all the time, but be on time. It just shows that you value people's time. And here's one that I don't see a lot. Know people's names. This is really valuable, and it's a personable thing, right? So know people's names when you're talking to them. You know, the root of animal welfare advocacy is really that we're just asking people to be kind and compassionate and respectful to everyone, right? So if we want to expect this from others, then we have to embody those characteristics ourselves. We have to be respectful. We have to be kind to others and show them what we're asking of them. Okay, so I've yammered on a lot, right? Let's summarize. So we've talked about a couple of things. We've talked about how do you approach doing research to make your advocacy effective. We've talked about tactics that you can develop your strategy with, and we've talked about qualities that you can embody to be an effective advocate, right? It's not groundbreaking stuff. Nothing that I'm talking about today is like a magic pill or something, but it can be a lot if you're new to this process. But it really just boils down to a few key points. And I think that if you remember these few key points, then you'll be off to a really good start. So the first thing, just know this truly, there is no one universal or magic way to influence change. There's just not. There are, though, practices and strategies that can enhance your likelihood of success. And that's what I've been trying to talk to you about today. And I hope that's what I've conveyed. It's not rocket science. We're not trying to, we're not trying to cure a disease here. It's just very simple, right? What we're trying to achieve is pretty straightforward. We're trying to strive for living beings to be treated compassionately and with respect, right? It's pretty simple. We just need to approach it with some thoughtfulness and some planning to help make our efforts meaningful and make our efforts effective. Second, remember, advocacy is rarely, if ever, a linear process. You can take 10 steps forward and the next day it'll all fall apart and you have to start from the beginning again. Or you could feel like everything is going downhill and everything is turning to crap. Nothing is progressing, and then something changes, and then all of a sudden something turns around. So keep the big picture and the end goal in mind. Try to remember what your finish line looks like that you defined for yourself. And also remember what you defined were your signs for saying, that's it, calling it quits. Don't forget that. And be patient, because the long game is really where the real change happens. Also, remember that the only certainty in advocacy is that change is inevitable. Change will happen. Anything can change over the course of your work. People, policies, positions, attitudes, right? Like funding, anything could change. You'll never be able to predict all the possible changes. All you can do is be as prepared as possible. When you know that change is coming, it'll make it less surprising and it'll prevent you from reacting and having to figure things out spontaneously. So try to think about the change that may happen and work from there. And then also regarding change, knowing how change happens will help you know how to make change happen and turn it into opportunity. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the process of change, right? So try to be aware of how governments make decisions, know how policies are developed and put into practice, be aware of the roles or the people that are involved in that process. Once you understand how change happens in your context, then you can get ahead of it. You can help prepare yourself for operating within the system effectively. And then you can be proactive with making change, right? So then you can be a part of that internal process. Understand also the value of community engagement and public support and how it can give a super strong voice to what you're trying to achieve. But as I mentioned earlier, harness it, direct it how you can when it's possible. And one other thing, having political will is really essential. It's really essential. So invest in the efforts it takes to gain political support. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to start at the top. Start where you have access to, but invest in those efforts. It is so much easier to fight within the system than out of the system. And you'll get so much further if you have a voice for your cause and a voice for your issue within the system, because you start to develop buy-in. You start to encourage conversations happening within the system, right? So invest in the efforts, invest in political will, develop those relationships. So I really just want to drive home, look, all of you, every single one of you can be an effective advocate. You're already here, you're working, you're learning, that's a huge part of this, right? There's no magic skills or secrets. There really is not. It doesn't require anything special. It just requires 3 simple things. Be prepared, be polite, and be persistent. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to be here with all of us. I hope that you found some of this information helpful. And if you have any questions, I hope I haven't gone too far over your time. Sorry, Elia, but yeah, I think it sounds great what you guys are working on, what the bits I heard, and I think it was fantastic. So keep at it, good luck, and I'll pass it over to you, Elia.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, for your time and all attendees. We have a question from Ella Wang. How do you measure impact with education, as in measure behavioral or attitude change, not just attendance? I'm sorry, we'll be only going with one question since we're very short on time and we're running late. So please, everyone, bear with us till the end. Thank you.
I'll answer that very quickly. It's tough. It's tough to address those kind of things in education. I'm working on an education project right now where we're going to be measuring those things, and we actually have a professor from New York who's designing the studies. So, I mean, it's not easy stuff. I think you can make it as simple or as complicated as you want, right? If you're collaborating with a school or with teachers, you can develop some kind of surveys where they're giving you qualitative reports on children's behavior, you know, frequency of negative behaviors, frequency of increasing positive behaviors, how they talk to each other at the community level. Are there increasing or decreasing instances of violent behaviors, for example? You know, there's a lot of different qualitative ways that you could look at that, working directly with the people in schools or with parents or community members to reflect that. Or you can also get as institutional as you want, or you can get as complex as you want by conducting a proper study. So I think it really depends on the context of the project that you're working on, or the scope of what you're working on, if you're working with one school or an entire school system, right? So I don't know if that answered your questions. One thing that I just want to point out before we finish too is that I have put together a document for all of you, if you're interested, that summarizes all of these questions. It's like a workshop document that can take you through all of this so you can practice it with your teams. I'm just finishing that up today. So if you send me an email on the info@joinhands.org that is on the chat, let me know that you're interested in that document and I can share that with you. And I'm also happy to, if anyone ever wants to have a follow-up session, you can also reach out to me as well and we can chat more about that if that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, for your time. I learned a lot from the session, given that I'm from the grassroots level. So it's a very different perspective for me. And I'm sure many of us have a lot to take away and a lot to reflect on today.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.